The night of August 5, 1944, was cold and clear in the rural landscape of New South Wales, Australia. Inside the barbed wire perimeter of the Cowra prisoner of war camp, over 1,000 Japanese soldiers lay awake in the darkness, waiting for a signal that would end their lives or set them free. This was not a typical prison escape, planned by men who were desperate to return to their families or their homes. It was a mass suicide pact forged in the fires of shame and cultural duty. The silence of the Australian bush was about to be shattered by the sound of a bugle and the roar of hundreds of voices screaming Banzai as they charged straight into machine gun fire. This event remains the largest prison breakout in the history of World War II and a bloody stain on the history of Australia. Cowra was a quiet farming town, located roughly 200 miles west of Sydney, nestled among rolling hills and wheat fields. The war felt distant to the local residents until the government established the No. 12 prisoner of war compound on the outskirts of their community. The camp was a massive circle divided into 4 distinct sections by broad thoroughfares known as Broadway. These avenues were designed to allow guards clear lines of sight and rapid movement in case of trouble. While the camp held Italians and Koreans, it was the Japanese sector that caused the most anxiety for the Australian authorities. The cultural divide between the captors and the captives was absolute, and neither side truly understood the motivations of the other, leading to a catastrophic failure of communication. For the Allied forces, capture was an unfortunate hazard of war, but for the Japanese soldier, surrender was the ultimate disgrace. They were indoctrinated from a young age with the belief that to be taken alive was a betrayal of the emperor and their ancestors. Many of the men inside the Cowra camp had been captured, while unconscious or wounded to commit suicide on the battlefield. Now that they had regained their health in the camp, the weight of their shame grew heavier with each passing day. They felt they were living on borrowed time, and that they were already dead to their families back in Japan. This psychological burden created a powder keg of resentment and desperation that needed only a single spark to ignite into total chaos. The guiding principle for these men was the Senjinkun, or the Field Service Code, which was issued by General Tojo in 1941. It explicitly stated that a soldier must never suffer the shame of being taken alive as a prisoner. This code was not just a military rule, but a spiritual mandate that defined their entire existence. In the eyes of the Japanese prisoners, the humane treatment they received from the Australians only deepened their humiliation. They were fed well and given medical care, and allowed to play baseball, but these comforts were seen as insults to their warrior spirit. They did not want comfort, they wanted a chance to redeem their honor through death. The Australians viewed them as model prisoners, initially unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Tensions within the camp began to rise as the population of the Japanese compound swelled beyond its intended capacity. By August of 1944, there were over 1,100 Japanese prisoners crammed into a space designed for much fewer men. The overcrowding made the atmosphere suffocating and allowed hardline leaders to exert more influence over the younger and less experienced soldiers. Groups formed within the huts, debating the merits of escape versus suicide. The moderate voices who might have been content to wait out the war were silenced by the fanatics who demanded action. The camp commander, Major Reuben Garrett, was aware of the growing hostility, but he underestimated the sheer ferocity of the plan that was taking shape in the barracks. The catalyst for the breakout came on Friday, August 4th, when Major Garrett summoned the Japanese camp leaders to his office. He informed them that due to the severe overcrowding, all private soldiers below the rank of Lance Corporal would be transferred to another camp in Hay, New South Wales. The separation would take place the following Monday. This administrative decision was intended to ease the pressure on the camp resources, but the prisoners interpreted it differently. They believed that separating the group was a tactic to break their spirit and sever their chain of command. The leaders returned to the compound and immediately convened a meeting to decide their course of action. The transfer order was the spark that the hardliners had been waiting for. Inside the huts, the Japanese soldiers held a vote to determine whether they would submit to the transfer or launch a mass attack. Because they lacked paper, they used toilet paper to cast their ballots. Each man wrote either a circle for yes or a cross for no regarding the uprising. The result was overwhelmingly in favor of the attack. Even those who were physically weak or sick felt compelled to join the majority rather than face the ostracization of their comrades. This was not an escape plan in the traditional sense, because they had no maps and no food and no weapons and nowhere to go. It was a collective decision to die in battle rather than submit to the shame of separation and continued imprisonment. The prisoners spent the rest of the day in a frenzy of preparation, constructing crude weapons from whatever materials they could find. They sharpened mess knives into daggers and fastened nails onto the ends of baseball bats and collected rocks. Some men wrapped strictures around their waists to suppress their appetites, while others wrote farewell letters to their families, knowing they would never be delivered. They put on their best clothes or layered multiple uniforms to offer some protection against the barbed wire. The atmosphere in the compound was electric with a dark sense of purpose. The Australian guards noticed the unusual activity, but they did not anticipate a full-scale suicidal assault. As night fell, the camp settled into an eerie silence that masked the violent preparations taking place inside the huts. The Australian garrison was on high alert, but they were vastly outnumbered by the prisoners. The guards manning the Vickers machine guns and the Lewis guns scanned the perimeter, watching for any sign of movement. The moon was full and bright, casting long shadows across the open ground of Broadway. Inside the Japanese compound, the leaders drank sake, which they had brewed illicitly, and toasted to their impending death. They agreed that the attack would begin at 2 in the morning, when the bugle sounded. The plan was to overwhelm the machine gun posts with sheer numbers. At exactly 2:00 in the morning, a Japanese prisoner named Hajime Toyoshima ran out into the center of the compound and blew a sharp blast on a bugle. The sound pierced the cold night air and signaled the beginning of the carnage. With a collective scream of banzai, hundreds of prisoners poured out of their huts and charged toward the perimeter fences. They moved in 3 distinct waves, crashing against the barbed wire like a human tsunami. The first wave threw blankets and baseball gloves onto the razor-sharp wire to create bridges for the men behind them. Others simply threw their bodies onto the fences, allowing their comrades to trample over them in a desperate bid to breach the line. Simultaneously, the prisoners set fire to their wooden huts. The dry timber caught fire instantly, sending massive plumes of orange flame and black smoke into the night sky. The fire illuminated the chaotic scene, making the charging prisoners visible to the Australian gunners. The heat was intense, and the roar of the flames mixed with the screams of the dying and the staccato rhythm of machine gun fire. It was a vision of hell on earth. The prisoners had no firearm, but they charged with a ferocity that terrified the guards. They hurled rocks and brandished their improvised clubs, ignoring the bullets that tore through their ranks. The Australian guards reacted with professional discipline, despite the shock of the sudden assault. Private Benjamin Hardy and Private Ralph Jones were manning the No. 2 Vickers machine gun, which was directly in the path of the main Japanese charge. They opened fire, cutting down the first wave of attackers, but the sheer volume of prisoners was overwhelming. The Japanese soldiers scrambled over the bodies of the fallen and continued their relentless advance. Realizing they were about to be overrun, Hardy and Jones held their position to the very last second, firing until the prisoners were upon them. In a final act of bravery, they attempted to disable the gun to prevent it from being used against their fellow guards. The Japanese wave crashed over the machine gun post, killing both Hardy and Jones. The prisoners seized the weapon, but they could not operate it effectively because the bolt had been removed or jammed by the dying Australians. This heroic action by Hardy and Jones undoubtedly saved many lives that night. Despite taking the gun post, the prisoners found themselves trapped in the open ground between the fences, swept by fire from the other guard towers. The breakout had succeeded in breaching the perimeter, but the cost was astronomical. Bodies lay piled in heaps along the wire, and the ground was slick with blood. While the main group attacked the machine guns, other prisoners attempted to break out through different sections of the perimeter. Some used the confusion and the smoke as cover to slip through holes in the wire. The Australian guards fired flares into the sky to illuminate the fields, turning the night into a grotesque tableau of moving shadows and muzzle flashes. The noise was deafening, a cacophony of bugles and screams and gunshots and roaring fire. For the residents of Cowra, the sounds of the battle drifted over the hills, causing panic and confusion. They knew the camp was there, but they could never have imagined a battle of this scale happening on their doorstep. Inside the burning compound, the scenes were even more horrific. Many prisoners who were too old or too sick to join the charge chose to commit suicide in their huts. Some hanged themselves from the rafters, while others used knives to cut their own throats. A few pleaded with their comrades to kill them. The fires consumed the buildings, and the bodies within them, leaving only charred remains by morning. The fanaticism that drove the breakout required total commitment, and those who could not fight chose to die by their own hand rather than remain as prisoners. As the sun began to rise over the Cowra landscape, the full extent of the tragedy became visible. The smoke from the smoldering ruins of the huts hung low over the valley. The perimeter fences were draped with the bodies of Japanese soldiers who had died trying to cross the wire. The ground was littered with crude weapons and baseball bats and unmailed letters. The Australian soldiers moved cautiously through the devastation, checking for survivors and securing the area. The medical teams were overwhelmed by the number of wounded prisoners who lay groaning in the grass. It was a scene of utter devastation that hardened veterans of the war would never forget. Despite the heavy casualties, over 300 Japanese prisoners had managed to escape into the surrounding countryside. They scattered in all directions, hiding in the rocky hills and the dense scrub. The Australian authorities immediately launched a massive manhunt, mobilizing police and soldiers, and even local civilians to track down the escapees. The people of Cowra were terrified. Rumors spread that the escaped prisoners were heavily armed and dangerous. Farm families locked their doors and loaded their shotguns, fearing that a horde of desperate soldiers would descend upon their homes. The reality of the escapees was quite different from the rumors. Most of the Japanese soldiers who had broken out had no plan beyond the wire. They were exhausted and hungry, and many were wounded. They wandered through the unfamiliar Australian bush with no food or water. Some simply sat down and waited to be recaptured, while others kept moving, driven by a vague desire to reach the coast or simply to die in freedom. They did not attack civilians. In fact, there were several accounts of escapees approaching farmhouses to ask for water or food politely and without aggression. One tragedy during the manhunt involved Lieutenant Harry Doncaster, who was the only Australian officer killed during the recapture operations. He was leading a patrol to round up a group of escapees when he was ambushed and killed. His death added to the toll of the Australian lives lost, bringing the total to 4. The other victims were Private Hardy and Private Jones, and a third soldier named Private Charles Shepard, who was stabbed to death during the initial breakout. The loss of these men was felt deeply by the local community and the nation. The manhunt continued for 9 days. The Australian terrain proved to be a formidable enemy for the Japanese soldiers who were ill-equipped for survival in the bush. The nights were freezing, and the days were dry and harsh. One by one, the escapees were rounded up or surrendered. Some chose to end their lives in the wilderness rather than return to the camp. 2 Japanese officers who had escaped together chose to hang themselves from a tree rather than be recaptured. Their bodies were found days later, a testament to their unwavering adherence to the Senjinkun code. By the time the last escapee was recaptured, the final death toll was staggering. 231 Japanese soldiers were dead, and 108 were wounded. The 4 Australian soldiers who died were hailed as heroes. The government ordered an immediate military court of inquiry to determine how such a catastrophe could have happened. The inquiry found that the camp conditions were in accordance with the Geneva Convention, and that the breakout was the result of the fanatical adherence to the Japanese military code. The Australian guards were exonerated and praised for their restraint and discipline under fire. The bodies of the Japanese soldiers were buried in a specially created cemetery near the camp. The Australians treated the dead with respect, burying them with full military honors, despite the violence of the breakout. This gesture of respect was significant. It recognized the soldiers not as criminals, but as combatants who had died for their country, however misguided their actions may have seemed to the Allied forces. This decision to honor the enemy dead would lay the groundwork for future reconciliation between the 2 nations. The Cowra Breakout remains a unique event in military history. It was the only land battle fought on the Australian mainland during World War II. It highlighted the extreme cultural differences that defined the Pacific War. To the Western mind, the breakout was a senseless waste of life, a suicidal charge with no strategic value. To the Japanese participants, it was a necessary act of spiritual cleansing, a way to erase the shame of captivity and restore their honor. These 2 worldviews collided that night on the barbed wire fences of Cowra. In the years following the war, the relationship between Japan and Australia began to heal. The Cowra War Cemetery became the only Japanese war cemetery in Australia, holding the remains of those who died in the breakout, as well as all other Japanese nationals who died in Australia during the war. The local people of Cowra, who had once lived in fear of the prisoners, took on the responsibility of tending to the graves. This act of compassion transformed the site from a place of tragedy into a symbol of peace. Today, Cowra is home to a magnificent Japanese garden designed by Ken Nakajima. It was built to honor the spirits of the dead and to celebrate the friendship that eventually blossomed between Cowra and Japan. The garden is a place of serenity and beauty, a stark contrast to the violence of 1944. Visitors walk along peaceful paths and view calm lakes standing on the very soil where blood was once spilled. It serves as a powerful reminder that even the deepest hatreds can be overcome by time and understanding. The legacy of the Cowra Breakout is complex. It is a story of fanaticism and futility, but also of bravery and honor. The actions of Privates Hardy and Jones, who died manning their gun, are remembered as the highest example of duty. The Japanese soldiers who charged the wire are remembered for their terrifying commitment to their code. The event forces us to confront the terrible power of ideology and the tragic cost of war. It challenges us to understand the enemy, even when their actions seem incomprehensible. Every year, a commemorative service is held at the cemetery, attended by officials from both Australia and Japan. They lay wreaths, and offer prayers for the souls of the departed. The story of the breakout is taught in schools, ensuring that the memory of that frozen August night is never lost. It stands as a cautionary tale about the dehumanizing nature of war and the importance of cross-cultural communication. The men who died there were victims of a global conflict that pitted nation against nation and philosophy against philosophy. The mystery of individual motivation still lingers. While the group acted as one, there were undoubtedly men in that camp who did not want to die. Men who were swept up in the hysteria or forced by their superiors to join the charge. Their voices were silenced by the collective roar of the crowd. We can only imagine the terror and the conflict they felt as they were pushed toward the wire. History records the movements of armies and the decisions of generals, but it often loses the quiet, desperate thoughts of the individual soldier trapped in a nightmare. As we look back on the Cowra Breakout, we see a tapestry woven with threads of tragedy and redemption. It is a reminder that history is not just a collection of dates and battles, but a human story filled with pain and hope. The largest prison escape of World War II did not change the outcome of the war, but it changed the people of Cowra, and it changed the way Australia and Japan viewed each other. It proved that even in the darkest moments of human conflict, the seeds of reconciliation can be planted. The final question that the Cowra Breakout leaves us with is one of perspective. Was it a heroic last stand or a tragic waste of life? Perhaps it was both. In the end, the earth of Cowra holds the bones of men who were enemies in life, but are now united in the silence of death. The wind that blows through the Japanese garden whispers the same truth to all who listen. War is a tragedy that leaves no true victors, only survivors, who must find a way to build a better world from the ashes of the past.